His job was to provide financing to Napoleon's government loans, currency exchanges, logistics support. When Napoleon fell, Jacob didn't flee or face execution. He simply shifted his services to the new regime. Within years, he was one of the most powerful bankers in France, funding the very government that had replaced his previous client. Same war, same years. One man died for loyalty. One man prospered through flexibility. The Rothschild strategy was elegant in its amorality. They funded both sides of the Napoleonic Wars simultaneously. Jacob in Paris supported Bonaparte. Nathan in London supported Wellington. If France won, Jacob's branch would prosper. If Britain won, Nathan's branch would dominate. The family as a whole couldn't lose. One-liner that captures their philosophy. The Rothschilds didn't pick sides in wars, they picked profits. It was a prison without guards. Picture a street barely 12 feet wide, lined with buildings so tall and cramped that sunlight reached the cobblestones only at noon. Within this single lane lived over 3,000 Jewish residents, packed into houses stacked 4 and 5 stories high. The gates locked at nightfall. No Jew could leave on Sundays or Christian holidays. Groups larger than 2 were forbidden. Public gardens, coffee shops, universities, all closed to anyone who lived behind those walls. This was the world Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born into in 1744. His family expected him to become a rabbi. That was the path for bright Jewish boys. Religious scholarship, community leadership, a life contained within the ghetto's boundaries. Mayer was studying for this future when both his parents died within the same year. He was 19 years old, suddenly responsible for younger siblings, with no income and no prospects. The death of his parents was the first mini-climax, the moment everything shifted. Mayer abandoned his religious studies and took an apprenticeship at a banking house in Hanover. There, surrounded by ledgers and currencies from across Europe, he discovered something that would change his life. Wealthy aristocrats were obsessed with rare coins. Roman denarii, Persian darics, Byzantine solidi. These ancient artifacts were status symbols, conversation pieces, proof of sophistication. And Mayer had a talent for finding them. What most people get fundamentally wrong about the Rothschild origin story is assuming Mayer was a financial genius from the start. He wasn't. He was a coin dealer, a merchant of curiosities. The banking came later almost accidentally, because he understood something more fundamental than finance. He understood access. Think of it like this. Imagine you're a traveling salesman in an era before phones, before internet, before any way to reach wealthy customers. How do you get in the door? You need something they want, something rare, something that makes them invite you back. Coins were Mayer's door opener. By his mid-20s, Mayer had returned to Frankfurt and built a reputation as the best rare coin dealer in the region. His clients included minor nobility, wealthy merchants, and eventually, through years of patient cultivation, Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel. Wilhelm was one of the richest men in Europe. His family had made fortunes renting out Hessian soldiers to foreign powers, including the British, who used them to fight American revolutionaries. Wilhelm had more money than he knew what to do with, and a collector's obsession with ancient coins. Mayer Amschel Rothschild still remembered the exact moment he received the title that changed everything. He was 45 years old, standing in an anteroom of Wilhelm's palace, holding a case of Roman coins he'd spent months acquiring. A clerk appeared with a document bearing the royal seal. Mayer had been appointed court factor official financial agent to the Crown Prince. This title meant everything. It meant legitimacy. It meant protection. It meant a Jew from the ghetto could now conduct business with nobility across the German states without the usual restrictions and humiliations. But Mayer understood something deeper. A court factor wasn't just a title. It was a mechanism. Here's the first direct question. If you were a prince in 1790 with millions in gold, how would you store it? Banks, as we know them, barely existed. Paper currency was unreliable. You needed someone you could trust to hold your money, invest it discreetly, and keep their mouth shut. Court factors filled that role. They were private bankers before private banking existed. Mayer became Wilhelm's financial shadow. He managed investments, facilitated loans, and handled transactions the prince preferred to keep quiet. The relationship made Mayer wealthy. More importantly, it taught him the mechanism of power. One-liner worth remembering: aristocrats needed money to maintain power. Bankers needed power to protect money. The relationship was symbiotic, and the Rothschilds understood which partner was actually indispensable. By the 1790s, Mayer had 5 sons. And here is where his genius shifted from individual success to dynastic strategy. Visualize a family meeting in the cramped Rothschild house in the Judengasse. Mayer, now in his 50s, sits at the head of a table surrounded by his boys, Amschel Salomon, Nathan Karl, and Jacob, ranging from teenagers to young men. He gives them 2 instructions that will guide the family for generations. First, always do business with ruling houses. Not merchants, not other bankers. Rulers, because rulers have armies to protect their assets and laws to enforce their contracts. Align with power. Second, father as many sons as possible. Keep the business in the family. Trust no outsiders with real authority. These instructions weren't sentimental. They were strategic. The first ensured political protection. The second ensured continuity without dilution. Here's the microhook, the mechanism that made everything else possible. Mayer didn't just send his sons to new cities. He created something that had never existed before: an international banking network bound by blood. Think about the financial world of 1800. There was no telegraph, no telephone, no internet. Information traveled at the speed of horses and ships. If you were a merchant in London and needed to pay a supplier in Vienna, the process took weeks. You had to physically transport gold or negotiate bills of exchange through multiple intermediaries, each taking a cut, each adding delay and risk. The Rothschild brothers eliminated those intermediaries. Nathan established himself in London. Salomon went to Vienna. Jacob settled in Paris. Karl took Naples. Amschel remained in Frankfurt to manage the original business. 5 brothers, 5 financial capitals, 5 nodes in a network that could move money faster than any competitor. The mechanism was elegant. If a London merchant needed to pay a Vienna supplier, he deposited money with Nathan in London. Nathan sent a coded letter to Salomon in Vienna. Salomon paid the supplier from his own reserves. The brothers settled their internal accounts later in bulk, reducing transaction costs and eliminating delays. This is essentially how international wire transfers work today. The Rothschilds invented the system 2 centuries before computers existed. But the real advantage wasn't speed, it was information. Every letter between the brothers contained more than financial instructions. It contained intelligence: what prices were in each city, what political developments were emerging, what opportunities were opening. The Rothschilds knew what was happening across Europe faster than any government ministry. Here's the unexpected twist: the brothers didn't just use official mail. They built their own courier network. Private messengers carrying coded letters across borders. Carrier pigeons for urgent communications. Fishing boats that could cross the English Channel when official ships were delayed by weather or war. Remember Nathan at Waterloo from Part 1. His courier arrived a full day before official news. That wasn't luck. It was infrastructure. The Rothschilds had invested years building communication systems that outpaced nations. Second direct question. In an age when information moved at horse speed, what was the value of knowing something a day before your competitors? The answer: fortunes, kingdoms, history itself. Göttle Rothschild. Mayer's wife lived to see her sons become the most powerful bankers in Europe. She was 89 years old, still living in the cramped Frankfurt house where she'd raised 10 children, when a neighbor asked if she was worried about the political upheavals threatening the continent. Her response became family legend. "Why should I worry?" she said. "My sons control the money." One more one-liner. She wasn't boasting. She was stating a structural fact. By 1810, the mechanism was in place. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 1 network. The infrastructure existed to move money and information faster than any power in Europe. All they needed was the right crisis to prove what they could do. That crisis arrived in the form of a short Corsican general who had conquered most of the continent and was now attempting to strangle Britain's economy through the largest trade embargo in history. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had no idea that the 5 brothers he dismissed as ghetto merchants were about to fund his destruction. The public story of the Napoleonic Wars goes like this. A military genius named Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Europe. The British, led by the Duke of Wellington, finally stopped him at Waterloo. Good triumphed over tyranny. The end. That story is true. It's also missing the most important part. While armies marched and emperors schemed, 5 brothers were running a parallel war, a financial war that would determine not just who won, but who profited from the winning. And in this shadow conflict, the Rothschilds didn't just participate, they controlled the outcome. Let me show you what actually happened. In 1803, Napoleon declared economic war on Britain. His strategy was called the Continental System, a complete trade embargo designed to strangle the British economy. No European port could accept British goods. No European merchant could trade with British companies. Napoleon believed he could defeat Britain without firing a shot by simply cutting off their commerce. The plan should have worked. Britain was an island nation dependent on trade. Without access to European markets, their economy would collapse. Their war effort would crumble, and Napoleon would rule everything from Portugal to Moscow. But Napoleon made one critical error. He assumed that when he closed the front door, no one would use the back door. Enter the Rothschilds. Nathan Rothschild still remembered the exact moment he realized the embargo was an opportunity, not an obstacle. He was 26 years old, recently arrived in Manchester, watching British textile merchants panic as their continental customers vanished. Warehouses filled with goods that couldn't be sold. Prices collapsed. Businesses failed. Nathan saw something different. He saw arbitrage. Here's how the mechanism worked. British goods were banned in Europe, which meant they were cheap in Britain, and expensive if you could get them on the continent. The price difference was enormous. All you needed was a way to move goods past Napoleon's blockade. Nathan had brothers in Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. He had a courier network that moved information faster than any government. He had relationships with smugglers, ship captains, and corrupt customs officials across the continent. Within months, Nathan had become the largest smuggler of British goods into Napoleonic Europe. Visualize the operation cotton textiles, leaving Manchester transported to small English ports, loaded onto fishing boats that crossed to neutral channels, then moved overland through a network of warehouses, safe houses, and bribed officials until they reached markets in Paris, Vienna, and beyond. At each step, the price increased. At the final sale, Nathan's profit margins exceeded 500%. One liner worth remembering. Napoleon tried to build a wall. The Rothschilds built a tunnel system. But smuggling was just the beginning. What most people get fundamentally wrong about the Rothschilds during the Napoleonic Wars is thinking they picked a side. They didn't. They picked both sides simultaneously, deliberately, and profitably. Jacob Rothschild was stationed in Paris throughout the war. His official job was to serve Napoleon's government, providing loans, managing currency exchanges, facilitating payments for military supplies. He was one of Napoleon's bankers. Meanwhile, Nathan in London was financing the British war effort. He arranged massive loans to the British government. He facilitated payments to Wellington's armies in Spain. He moved gold bullion across the Channel to pay British soldiers fighting against the very regime his brother was serving. First, direct question. How do you fund both sides of a war without being discovered and executed by both? The answer is discretion, family loyalty, and the universal truth that governments at war need bankers. More than bankers need governments. Here's the first micro hook. The same gold that Jacob helped Napoleon collect in taxes would sometimes end up weeks later in Wellington's military chest, moved through the Rothschild network with a profit taken at each step. The brothers didn't see this as treason. They saw it as business. Wars are expensive. Governments always need money. Someone will provide that money. Why not them? But as the war dragged on, the Rothschilds made a calculation that would shape history. By 1814, it was becoming clear that Napoleon was losing. His invasion of Russia had been catastrophic. Coalition armies were closing in from all directions. The question wasn't whether Napoleon would fall, but when and what opportunities his fall would create. Nathan Rothschild made the decision. The family would shift its weight toward Britain. Jacob in Paris began quietly reducing the funds available to Napoleon's government. Small delays in loan disbursements. Slightly unfavorable exchange rates. Nothing dramatic enough to arouse suspicion. Just enough friction to sand down Napoleon's financial machinery while his military position deteriorated. Simultaneously, Nathan doubled down on British government bonds. He bought massively, betting everything on a British victory. This is the second unexpected twist. The Rothschilds didn't just predict Napoleon's defeat. They helped engineer it, not with weapons, but with financial drag on one side and financial support on the other. Pause this video for a moment. Think about what this means. We celebrate Wellington as the hero of Waterloo. We study Napoleon's tactical mistakes. But no one mentions that the financial conditions of the war were being quietly shaped by 5 brothers with no army, no territory, and no allegiance to any flag. The rage moment arrives here. Let me show you the human contrast. Jean-Pierre Beaumont was a 23-year-old conscript from Lyon, drafted into Napoleon's Imperial Guard in 1812. He survived the retreat from Moscow, walking through frozen hellscape, watching comrades freeze to death, eating horses that had collapsed from exhaustion. He survived the battles of 1813 and 1814. By Waterloo, he was a sergeant, one of the old guard, the elite troops Napoleon held in reserve for the final assault. When Napoleon ordered the guard forward at Waterloo, Jean-Pierre marched into British artillery fire with his unit. Grape shot tore through their ranks. He was wounded in the leg, captured, and spent months in a British prisoner camp before being released to walk home to a France that no longer had a place for him. He died in poverty in 1847, his military pension having been cancelled by successive governments. Meanwhile, on the same day, Jean-Pierre was being cut down by British cannons. Nathan Rothschild stood at his pillar in the London Stock Exchange, executing the strategy we described in Part 1. He knew Napoleon had lost. He knew Jean-Pierre's sacrifice was already history, and he was converting that knowledge into wealth. Here's the calculation that should disturb you. Every soldier who died at Waterloo, French, British, Prussian, Dutch, died fighting for governments that were in debt to the same family. The Rothschilds would profit from Napoleon's defeat. They would have profited from his victory. The only people who couldn't profit were the men bleeding in the mud. One-liner that captures the obscenity. The soldiers paid with their lives. The Rothschilds collected interest. Let me show you exactly how the Waterloo trade worked. Remember the courier network from Part 2? The private messengers, the carrier pigeons, the fishing boats that could cross the channel when official ships waited for better weather. That infrastructure had been built over years. On June 18, 1815, it delivered its ultimate return. Nathan's agent at Waterloo watched the battle from a safe distance. When Napoleon's defeat became certain, he rode to the coast, hired a fishing boat, and crossed to England in rough seas that delayed official messengers by over a day. He reached Nathan in London on the morning of June 20th. Visualize the scene: Nathan standing at his exchange pillar face, expressionless, showing none of the excitement that must have been burning inside. He began to sell. Slowly at first, then with increasing volume. British government bonds, stocks, everything. The traders watched him. Nathan always knew things first. If he was selling, something terrible must have happened. Wellington must have lost. Panic spread through the exchange. Prices collapsed. Men who had bet on British victory watched their fortunes evaporate. Some sold everything at any price just to escape the falling market. And then through agents spread across the trading floor, Nathan began to buy. Quietly, in small lots that didn't attract attention, accumulating a massive position in securities that everyone else was desperate to sell. Second direct question: is this insider trading market manipulation or just information arbitrage? The answer depends on whether you were Nathan or one of the men he was buying from. Thomas Richardson was a 41-year-old merchant banker who had invested his entire firm's capital in British bonds, confident in Wellington's eventual victory. When he saw Nathan selling, he panicked and liquidated his position at a 60% loss. By the time official news of the victory arrived the next day, Richardson's firm was bankrupt. He spent the remaining 20 years of his life trying to rebuild, never recovering his former position. Nathan Rothschild, using Richardson's panic, acquired those same bonds at a fraction of their value. When prices surged on the victory announcement, his profit was estimated at 600% in less than 48 hours. Same information, different access, opposite outcomes. Here's the second micro hook, the detail that connects to everything that came after. Nathan didn't just make money at Waterloo. He acquired control. The British government owed massive war debts loans that the Rothschilds held significant portions of. After Waterloo, as Europe reorganized and governments scrambled to stabilize their finances, the Rothschilds weren't just creditors, they were essential infrastructure. Within a decade, no major European government would make significant financial decisions without consulting the family. Not because the Rothschilds had armies, because they had something more powerful: they held the debt. One more one-liner to carry forward. Napoleon learned that empires require armies. The Rothschilds proved that armies require bankers. The third unexpected twist comes now. The family's greatest victory at Waterloo planted the seeds of something they never anticipated. By becoming indispensable to governments, the Rothschilds became visible. By becoming visible, they became targets. The same techniques that had worked in the shadow of war would now operate in the spotlight of peace. And with visibility came something the brothers had never faced in the ghetto. The full weight of centuries-old hatred now focused on a family that seemed to prove every dark suspicion that had ever been whispered about Jewish money. The mythology that would haunt their descendants and fuel conspiracy theories for 2 centuries began forming in the aftermath of their greatest triumph. But that's a story about consequences, about empires built and enemies made, about a legacy that stretched far beyond anything 5 brothers from a Frankfurt ghetto could have imagined. The machine they built at Waterloo would go on to fund the Suez Canal, the diamond mines of Africa, the oil empires of America, and some historians argue the creation of a nation that didn't exist when Napoleon fell. Empires built on gold don't crumble like those built on conquest. They transform. They adapt. They outlive the nations they once served. After Waterloo, the Rothschilds didn't rest. They expanded. And the century that followed would prove that their victory over Napoleon was just the opening move in a much longer game. Let me show you what happened to the world they shaped. By 1825, barely a decade after Waterloo, the 5 Rothschild brothers controlled an estimated $6 million, roughly $900 million in today's currency. But wealth alone doesn't capture their position. They had become the financial infrastructure of Europe. Governments didn't just borrow from them. Governments needed them to function. Visualize a map of Europe in 1830. Every major capital, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt, has a Rothschild branch. Every government owes them money. Every significant financial decision passes through their network before it happens. This wasn't control through force. It was control through dependency. What most people get fundamentally wrong about the Rothschild legacy is measuring it in money. Their true impact wasn't wealth accumulation. It was the template they created, the proof that transcending borders, funding multiple sides, and controlling information could make a private family more powerful than public governments. Every modern investment bank operates on principles the Rothschilds pioneered. Every hedge fund that profits from crisis, every financial institution that spans continents, every family office that serves the ultra-wealthy, they're all descendants of the Frankfurt Ghetto's most successful export. Let me show you the trajectories that emerged from this template. Friedrich Hartmann was a German merchant banker in 1820, operating in Hamburg, with a respectable business lending to local traders. He was 43 years old, well-established, confident in his methods. When the Rothschilds began expanding their operations into northern Germany, Friedrich dismissed them as upstarts ghetto Jews who'd gotten lucky during the war. By 1830, the Rothschilds had captured most of his major clients. Their international network could offer services Friedrich couldn't match: faster transfers, better exchange rates, access to capital markets in London and Paris. Friedrich's revenues dropped by 60% in 5 years. He spent the 1830s desperately trying to compete with an institution that operated on a completely different scale. Friedrich Hartmann died in 1847, his bank long since absorbed by a Rothschild-affiliated institution. His sons became clerks in the very organization that had destroyed their father's business. Now contrast this with someone who understood the new rules. August Belmont was 19 years old in 1837, working as an apprentice in the Rothschild Frankfurt office. When financial panic struck America that year, Belmont saw opportunity. He sailed to New York, established himself as the Rothschilds' American agent, and began building connections that would last generations. By 1847, the year Friedrich Hartmann died in obscurity, August Belmont was one of the richest men in America. He had married the daughter of Commodore Perry, moved in the highest social circles, and wielded influence that shaped American politics for decades. His descendants would own newspapers, racehorses, and help finance the construction of New York's subway system. Same decade, same financial upheaval. One man fought the new system, one man joined it. Opposite trajectories. First direct question. When the rules of the game change, do you adapt or do you insist the old rules should still apply? The Rothschild template didn't just create individual winners and losers. It reshaped entire nations. Here's the first micro hook. The same family that defeated Napoleon would later determine whether entire countries could exist. In 1875, the British government desperately needed money. The Suez Canal had just been completed, a waterway that cut the journey from London to India from months to weeks. The Egyptian ruler who controlled the canal was nearly bankrupt and looking to sell his shares. If France bought them, Britain would lose control of its most important trade route. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli needed £4 million immediately. Parliament wasn't in session. There was no time for normal procedures. He sent a message to Lionel Rothschild, Nathan's son, now head of the London branch. "How much do you need?" Lionel asked. £4 million. Tomorrow." Lionel didn't consult committees, didn't check with partners. He ate a grape, considered for a moment, and replied, "You shall have it." The next day, Britain owned the Suez Canal. A single family had given a single government the power to control global shipping for the next 80 years. One liner worth remembering: Parliament debates. Governments negotiate. The Rothschilds just write checks. But the family's reach extended far beyond canals and government bonds. Cecil Rhodes was a sickly young Englishman who arrived in South Africa in 1870, hoping the climate would improve his health. He was 17 years old, had no money and no prospects. Within 2 decades, he controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. How did a penniless teenager build a monopoly? Rothschild financing. The family recognized the diamond opportunity early and provided Rhodes with the capital to consolidate the scattered South African mines into a single company, De Beers. The Rothschilds became major shareholders. Rhodes became fabulously wealthy, and the African continent became a resource extraction zone that would fund European expansion for generations. Second direct question. When you hear about the scramble for Africa, do you picture soldiers with rifles or bankers with checkbooks? The bankers came first. The rifles followed. The same pattern repeated with oil. John D. Rockefeller was building Standard Oil in America during the 1870s and 1880s. He needed capital to buy out competitors, build refineries, and establish the monopoly that would make him the richest American in history. Where did that capital come from? The Rothschilds held a governing interest in the National City Bank of Cleveland. Through this position, they provided crucial financing as Rockefeller consolidated the oil industry. They didn't control Standard Oil directly. Rockefeller was too ambitious for that, but they profited from its rise and influenced its expansion. Visualize a web spreading from Frankfurt across the Atlantic, diamonds in Africa, oil in America, canals in Egypt, railways across Europe. The Rothschild template had become a global system. But here's the first unexpected twist. The very success that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. The Rothschild family had spent decades cultivating relationships with monarchies and aristocracies. They understood courts, kings, and the old European order. What they didn't anticipate was that order collapsing. The Naples branch was the first to fall. In 1860, Italian nationalists under Giuseppe Garibaldi swept through southern Italy. The Rothschilds had been closely tied to the Bourbon monarchy. When the monarchy fell, the family's position became untenable. By 1863, the Naples branch closed permanently, the first crack in the empire. Adolf Karl von Rothschild was 62 years old when he watched his family's Italian operations dissolve. 3 generations of work relationships and accumulated influence gone in 3 years of political upheaval. He died in 1900, having spent his final decades watching the world his family had built begin to fragment. Meanwhile, a different kind of force was rising. The Frankfurt branch. The original Rothschild Bank, founded by Meyer himself, closed in 1901. Not through political upheaval, not through competition, through the failure to produce male heirs. Here's the callback to part 2. Remember Meyer's instruction to his son's father, as many sons as possible. Keep the business in family hands. The Frankfurt branch followed this rule for 3 generations. Then the male line ended, and with it, the original heart of the Rothschild network. The pattern accelerated in the 20th century. This is the second micro-hook. The family that had outsmarted Napoleon would face an enemy even more destructive. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria. The Vienna Rothschilds, one of the most powerful branches, faced the full horror of state-sponsored persecution. Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild, head of the Austrian branch, was arrested and held for over a year. His release required a ransom estimated at $21 million, the largest individual payment to the Nazi regime. Everything else was seized. Homes, businesses, art collections accumulated over a century. The Vienna branch that had financed emperors became plunder for fascists. The Rothschilds who escaped did so with their lives and little else. Those who remained in occupied territories faced the same fate as millions of other European Jews. One more one-liner. The family that had funded both sides of the Napoleonic Wars discovered there are some conflicts where neutrality isn't possible. The Paris branch survived the war, but not French politics. In 1982, the socialist government of François Mitterrand nationalized the Rothschild Bank. 2 centuries after the family had helped fund France's recovery from Napoleon's defeat, a French government seized their assets. The irony was not lost on observers. Napoleon's ghost finally claimed revenge. Here's the second unexpected twist. Despite losing 4 of 5 original branches, the Rothschild survived, the London branch. Nathan's legacy remained. And in 2008, the scattered family holdings were reorganized under a single company for the first time since Meyer sent his sons to different cities 2 centuries earlier. Today, the consolidated Rothschild holdings include financial services, real estate, mining, energy, and over 24 wineries worldwide. The London bank that Nathan founded still operates, reporting $3.2 billion in revenue and $109 billion in assets under management in 2022. Combined family wealth is estimated at $1.2 trillion. Visualize a timeline stretching from 1744 Meyer's birth in the ghetto to today. Wars, revolutions, world wars, genocide, nationalization. Through all of it, the family adapted, contracted when necessary, expanded when possible, and survived. The question isn't whether the Rothschilds were good or evil. That framing misses the point entirely. The question is what their survival teaches us about the relationship between money and power, between families and nations, between those who fund history and those who merely live through it. And that question isn't historical. It's immediate. Because the template they created didn't die with the old branches. It evolved. It multiplied. It became the operating system of modern finance. So what does a family that outsmarted Napoleon 2 centuries ago have to do with your life in 2025? Everything. Let me show you why. The Rothschild story isn't history. It's a template. And that template is running right now all around you in ways you interact with every single day. Remember Nathan's courier network from Part 1, the private messengers and carrier pigeons that delivered news of Waterloo before any government knew the outcome. That was an information advantage measured in hours. Today, high-frequency trading firms spend billions building fiber optic cables that shave milliseconds off transaction times. The principle is identical. The scale is different. The profits are larger. Remember Mayer's 2 instructions from Part 2. Always serve ruling houses, father as many sons as possible. Modern family offices operate on the same logic. Proximity to power, concentration of wealth within bloodlines. The ultra-wealthy today don't just invest differently than you. They exist in a different system, one designed like the Rothschild network to transcend the boundaries that constrain everyone else. Remember Jacob funding Napoleon, while Nathan funded Wellington from Part 3. That wasn't ancient history. That's the defense industry today, where the same contractors profit regardless of which side wins, which party governs, or which crisis erupts. Diversification across conflict isn't cynicism. It's strategy. The patterns repeat because they work. First direct question. If the same strategies that created dynastic wealth in 1815 still operate in 2025, what does that tell you about how little the game has actually changed? Let me revisit someone from where we began. Thomas Richardson, the merchant banker from Part 3, who panicked during Nathan's Waterloo manipulation and lost everything, died in 1847, never having recovered his former position. But his grandson, William Richardson, learned from the family's destruction. He didn't fight the Rothschild system. He studied it. By 1890, William had built a modest investment firm in London, based on one principle: never bet against those with better information. He taught his children to identify who had structural advantages and position accordingly. The Richardson family never became wealthy, but they never lost everything again either. The lesson: cross generations, understand the game before you play it. Now contrast this with someone operating in today's world. Sarah Chen is 34 years old, a quantitative analyst at a New York hedge fund. She builds algorithms that detect information asymmetries, moments when one party knows something others don't. Her models scan news feeds, satellite imagery, shipping data, even social media sentiment. She's doing with computers what Nathan did with couriers. The edge is always information, Sarah told me. Speed, access, context. The people who win consistently aren't smarter. They just know things first. Sarah earns $2.3 million annually. She's very good at her job. But she's also clear-eyed about where she sits in the hierarchy. I work for people who have edges I'll never have. Political connections, regulatory access, generational relationships. I'm good at the game, but I didn't design the game. One-liner worth remembering: the players change. The game stays the same. Here's the unexpected twist that should reframe everything you've heard. The Rothschilds aren't a conspiracy. They're a case study. The real lesson isn't that one family secretly controls the world. The real lesson is that certain structures, information advantages, political access, cross-border networks, multi-generational wealth transfer, produce predictable outcomes regardless of who operates them. The Rothschilds didn't invent these structures. They perfected them, and then others copied them. Visualize a family tree, but instead of names, fill it with institutions. The Rothschild template produced J.P. Morgan. Morgan's template influenced Goldman Sachs. Goldman's alumni spread across government and finance, creating networks that mirror the five brothers in 5 cities. The bloodline isn't genetic, it's structural. What most people get fundamentally wrong about financial power is personalizing it. They look for villains. They want to name names. But the system doesn't require specific villains. It produces similar outcomes, whoever runs it. Second direct question. If you replaced every person in the current financial elite with completely different people, would the system operate differently, or would it produce the same results through the same mechanisms? Let me re-anchor what this video has actually been about. This wasn't conspiracy content. The Rothschilds are documented history, not secret speculation. Everything I've described, the Waterloo trade, the dual funding of Napoleon and Wellington, the Suez Canal, purchased the financing of Rhodes and Rockefeller is in historical records, academic studies, and the family's own archives. The goal wasn't to reveal hidden puppeteers. The goal was to show you how financial power actually operates across generations, across borders, across conflicts. Not because knowing this makes you rich, but because not knowing it makes you blind. Here's a simple framework. Not financial advice, just questions worth asking. First, when major events happen, wars, crises, panics, who profits regardless of outcome? The answer reveals structural advantages. Second, how does information flow? Who knows things first, and what do they do with that knowledge before others react? Third, what games am I playing where others design the rules, and what would change if I understood those rules clearly? These questions don't make you wealthy, they make you aware. And awareness is the first step toward not being someone else's profit margin. Let me close the loop on where we started. Nathan Rothschild died in 1836, 21 years after Waterloo. He was 58 years old, the richest man in Britain, arguably the most powerful financier in the world. His final years were spent expanding the family network, securing positions for his children, and ensuring the dynasty would outlast him. His great-great-great-grandchildren still manage billions today. Meanwhile, the descendants of Jean-Pierre Beaumont, the French sergeant who was wounded at Waterloo while Nathan traded on his sacrifice scattered across France, worked ordinary jobs and left no historical record. They lived. They died. They were forgotten. The contrast isn't about virtue. Jean-Pierre was brave. Nathan was clever. Both operated within systems they didn't create. But one understood how power actually works, and one was its instrument. One more one-liner. History remembers those who shape it. It forgets those who are shaped by it. Here's the final, unexpected twist. The Rothschilds today are wealthy, but not dominant. Their combined $1.2 trillion fortune, while staggering, represents a smaller share of global wealth than the family controlled in 1850. New dynasties have risen. New networks have formed. The specific family matters less than the template they proved works. But here's what hasn't changed. The game still rewards information, advantages, political proximity, multi-generational planning, and the ability to profit from both sides of any conflict. The players rotate. The principles endure. Visualize the final image: a narrow street in Frankfurt's Judengasse, where Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744. The ghetto is gone now, destroyed in World War II bombing. A plaque marks where the family house once stood. Tourists walk past without stopping. They don't realize they're standing at the birthplace of modern finance. From that cramped street emerged a network that funded the defeat of Napoleon. The construction of the Suez Canal, the diamond mines of Africa, the oil fields of America, and the creation of financial systems that govern your life today. The signature line that captures everything: They didn't conquer nations. They made nations dependent on them. That was smarter. Mayor Rothschild told his sons to serve ruling houses and multiply heirs. 2 centuries later, the strategy still works, not because the Rothschilds still control everything, but because the principles they proved are now embedded in how global finance operates. You are living in a world their template built. Understanding that doesn't make you powerful, but it makes you something almost as valuable. It makes you aware. And in a system designed to profit from those who don't understand it, awareness is the one advantage they can't take from you. The Rothschilds outsmarted Napoleon with information patience and the willingness to fund both sides of history. The question isn't whether that was moral. The question is whether you'll spend your life on one side of that equation or learn to see the whole board.